One of the more common problem areas for students on the ACT English test and the SAT writing test, in particular on the grammar questions of those sections, is punctuation, and especially commas, colons, and semicolons. So if this sounds like you, if you have problems with comma usage, with proper colon usage, where do you use semicolons, this video may help, because I want to point your attention to an underlying issue that you might be having that you don't realize, and that is actually the source of your issues when it comes to knowing when to use a comma or a colon or whatever. So a lot of students have a number of rules or approaches to figuring out whether they should use a comma and where, or not when they should use a comma, or whether they should use a colon instead. And these methods at first may help you on some questions, but eventually these methods break down because they can't completely explain when to use commas or colons or semicolons in certain situations. So some of these more incomplete methods, and these may be methods that you use, include the following. The first one is sound. This is the most common. So how does the sentence sound if I put in a comma or remove one or whatever? And sound can get you only so far, because a lot of times things may sound wrong but actually be right, or they may sound right but actually be wrong. So sound is a good first step, and it's a good check in some ways, but it's not going to take you all the way. Another method that students use is they pay attention to their breathing. So a lot of times we get taught a pseudo rule, which is, oh, you use a comma when you take a breath, or if you pause in the sentence, that's where you have to use the punctuation mark. And again, as a first approximation, as a simple rule of thumb, I suppose it's okay, but you can't go into the ACT or the SAT with that as a rule, because it's going to break down very often. Another one is intuition. So you may not understand grammar rules, but you just have a kind of internal sense of how the sentence feels on some level, and then you know, okay, I feel like a comma belongs here, and you can't maybe articulate why, but you have some sort of intuitive sense that tells you where punctuation should go and which punctuation mark you should use. And again, this is not bad. A lot of really strong students do well on the ACT English and SAT writing without really knowing the rules or the formal language of grammar, but because they've got a strong intuition, because maybe they've read a lot or they do a lot of writing, they can manage their way through a lot of the tests. But again, this even intuition, strong intuition, will break down. And then finally, another one that students use is flow. So how does the sentence flow if I use the comma here, or if I connect these? Is there like a break in flow? And again, it's very similar to intuition and sound and breathing. It's this kind of unarticulated gut feeling about a sentence rather than understanding how it's put together. So what do we have to do instead? How do we learn where to put commas or colons or semicolons? And this is going to be very general advice. You'll have to look at specific videos for more information on this. But it actually comes down to sentence structure. What are the components of a sentence? How do they fit together to create larger sentence components? And how do you connect or attach different sentence chunks to create a big sentence with the proper punctuation, etc.? So it really comes down to first identifying what the parts of a sentence are so that you know how they should be put together. So parts of a sentence or sentences that you don't need to understand include clauses and phrases. So you need to know the difference between a clause and a phrase, because we're going to treat clauses and phrases differently when we're putting sentences together. You're going to want to know what a complete sentence is versus an incomplete sentence. And sometimes incomplete sentences, move this over here. Sometimes incomplete sentences, you'll hear them called fragments. So you need to be able to identify which part of the sentence is complete, which is incomplete, where there's a fragment, where there's complete sentences, so that when you have to put them together, you do so in the right way. And then finally, independent and dependent clauses. Related in some sense to complete and incomplete sentences, but again, you need to know which sentences, which clauses can stand alone, that they're independent, versus which ones have to be attached to a main sentence or an independent sentence. They cannot stand alone. So punctuation actually comes down to knowing this more than really knowing rules. I mean, certainly there are rules for comma usage and rules for colons and rules for semicolons, and I go over these in the ACT English Bootcamp and the SAT Writing Bootcamp. But before you can really understand those rules, you have to understand how sentences are put together. So how you might also, related to this, how you might identify the subjects of sentences and the verbs of sentences and how they create clauses or they create phrases and how those clauses and phrases are independent or dependent, or then how you stick them together. Should you use commas or semicolons or colons? It all comes down to understanding sentence structure. So if you're having problems with commas, colons, and semicolons, take a step back and watch the videos or rewatch the videos on clauses, phrases, fragments, and independent and dependent clauses, because, or sometimes these are known as subordinate clauses. Because once you have that understanding, then when you can identify that clause or this clause, you can then put them together effectively, and then that's where the punctuation rules come in. And then once you have the punctuation rules, once you understand this foundation, the punctuation rules just kind of attach on top of them. But the rules aren't the hard part. It's the underlying stuff that you need to get first. Once you get that, the rules are rather straightforward. So understand sentence structure, and that can help you understand commas, colons, and semicolons. To learn more about Reason Prep's SAT, SAT subject test, and ACT video courses, go to reasonprep.com/enroll, and you can find the link in the description below the video.